In 1743, the city of London was drowning, not in water, but in a clear, sharp-smelling spirit that cost less than a loaf of bread. Records from that year suggest the English were consuming somewhere around 8 gallons of distilled spirits per person annually, men, women, and children included. Mothers were found dead in the streets with infants still clutched in their arms, both of them poisoned by the same cheap bottle. Magistrates reported that entire parishes had turned into open-air taverns, one in every 4 or 5 houses in parts of the city selling liquor, no license required, no questions asked. Death rates in London began to outpace birth rates for the first time in generations, and physicians of the era began to whisper that the city itself might be shrinking. Not from plague, not from famine, not from war, but from drink. And there was one drink at the center of it: gin. Today, gin is the base of a $5 cocktail at a rooftop bar, something you sip slowly with a wedge of lime and call refreshing. In the 1740s, it was blamed, quite literally, for a falling national population. So how did a juniper-flavored spirit, something you can buy in a plastic bottle at a corner shop today, become powerful enough that the British Parliament had to pass law after law simply to keep the country from drinking itself into collapse? How did it go from medicine to menace to a symbol of national shame, and then, centuries later, into the poshest drink on the shelf? That was 1743. But the story of gin does not start in London. It starts nearly 2,000 years earlier, in the pharmacies and kitchens of the ancient world, with a small, bitter, blue-black berry that nobody was drinking at all. Juniper is a scrubby, hardy, evergreen shrub that grows across huge stretches of the northern hemisphere, from the rocky hillsides of the Mediterranean to the cold forests of Scandinavia. Its berries, technically not berries at all, but tiny fleshy cones, have a sharp, resinous, almost peppery flavor, and ancient peoples figured out fairly quickly that this plant was not just food, it was medicine. Egyptian papyri dating back thousands of years reference juniper as a treatment for intestinal complaints. Ancient Greek physicians, including Hippocrates, wrote about juniper as a remedy for various ailments, and Roman writers described using the berries as a cheaper, homegrown substitute for imported black pepper, since pepper had to be shipped in from India at enormous cost. They did not know the word antiseptic. They did not know the word diuretic. They just knew that this bitter little berry seemed to help, and they kept using it, generation after generation, long before anyone thought to distill it into alcohol at all. Juniper was not just a Mediterranean phenomenon either. Archaeological and historical evidence suggests that juniper berries were being used across a huge swath of the ancient and medieval world, from Scandinavia, where the berries flavored preserved meats and fish through brutal northern winters, to medieval England itself, where juniper appears in surviving herbal manuscripts as a treatment for everything from kidney complaints to digestive ailments. In a world without refrigeration, without antibiotics, without any real understanding of how disease actually spread, a bitter, strongly aromatic plant that seemed to genuinely help people feel better was not a curiosity. It was survival technology. Communities passed down the knowledge of which plants worked and which did not, generation after generation, entirely through observation and trial and error. They did not know the word antimicrobial. They were using it anyway. Now, here is the detail that makes this story strange from the very beginning. For most of human history, juniper and alcohol were two completely separate things. Juniper was medicine. Alcohol, in the form of beer, wine, and various fermented drinks, was food and drink. Nobody had put the two together yet because nobody had the technology to do it. That changed with the spread of distillation, a technique refined by Arab chemists in the medieval period and gradually carried into Europe through Spain and Italy, where monasteries and universities began experimenting with it to create concentrated medicinal tinctures. Distillation itself was originally a tool of alchemy and medicine, not recreation. Early European distillers were not trying to make something pleasant to drink. They were trying to isolate what they called the essential spirit of a substance, its concentrated healing power. and alcohol turned out to be a remarkably effective solvent for pulling those essential oils and compounds out of plants like juniper. And it was in the monasteries and university towns of continental Europe, not in England, where juniper finally met distilled spirit for the first time. This is where the story takes a turn nobody expected. The credit for inventing gin, in the popular version of the story, usually goes to a Dutch physician named Franciscus Sylvius, who supposedly created it in the 1600s at the University of Leiden as a medicinal tonic, a way to deliver the healing properties of juniper oil in an easy-to-drink alcohol-based form. Now, historians have largely debunked this as the single origin point. Juniper-flavored spirits appear in Dutch and Flemish records earlier than Sylvius's supposed invention, and the truth is messier and more gradual, the kind of slow, unglamorous evolution that does not make for a great origin story. But the myth persists anyway, because it is a good story, a respected doctor accidentally inventing one of the most consumed spirits on Earth while trying to cure stomach ailments. Whether Sylvius personally invented it or simply popularized an existing recipe remains debated among scholars. But what is beyond dispute is that by the early 1600s, the Dutch and Flemish were producing a juniper-flavored malt spirit they called jenever, from the Dutch word for juniper, jenever. And this is where the English word gin ultimately comes from, a clipped anglicized version of that Dutch name. Genever was not the gin you would recognize today. It was made from a malt wine base, a grainy, somewhat sweet, unrefined spirit that on its own tasted rough and unpleasant, almost like bad whiskey. Juniper and other botanicals were added not just for flavor but to mask that harshness. Dutch and Flemish distillers built entire industries around it, particularly in cities like Schiedam near Rotterdam, which became so associated with Genever production that its nickname was essentially Gin City, its skyline eventually dominated by windmills built specifically to grind the grain that fed dozens of local distilleries. By the early 1600s, Genever was being sold across the Low Countries in pharmacies as medicine and in taverns as a drink, and it was cheap, it was strong, and it was everywhere. The timing mattered too. The Dutch Republic in the 1600s was, by the standards of the era, an extraordinary commercial power, the center of a global trading empire that stretched from the Spice Islands of the East Indies to the fur-trapping outposts of the Hudson River in North America. Amsterdam was awash in capital, in shipping, in warehoused goods from every corner of the known world. Distilling Genever fit neatly into this commercial machine. Another product to manufacture, another commodity to trade, another export to load onto ships already crossing the English Channel and the North Sea daily. Dutch merchants did not need to convince the English that Genever was worth trying. English soldiers were about to do that job for them, on a battlefield, for free. Here is where England enters the story, and it enters through war, not commerce. During the 30 Years' War and the 80 Years' War, which dragged much of continental Europe into brutal, prolonged conflict throughout the early and mid-1600s, English soldiers fought alongside Dutch troops on the continent. And English soldiers, cold, frightened, and standing in muddy trenches before battle, noticed that their Dutch allies had a habit of taking a shot of Genever before combat to steady their nerves. The English, being English, adopted the practice and gave it a nickname that has survived for nearly 400 years: Dutch courage. Now that phrase alone tells you something important. Genever was not just a drink to the English at this point. It was already tangled up with bravery, with toughness, with a certain rough, soldierly masculinity. It had a reputation before it had a market. But the real turning point, the moment that took gin from a foreign curiosity to a full-blown English institution, came in 1688, with a political event that had nothing to do with alcohol at all: the Glorious Revolution. In that year, the English Parliament invited the Dutch Prince William of Orange to take the English throne alongside his wife Mary, deposing the unpopular Catholic King James II in the process. William became King William III of England, and he brought with him not just Dutch political influence, but Dutch tastes, Dutch financial systems, and, whether directly intended or not, a Dutch drink. Pay attention to this next detail, because it explains almost everything that follows. England at this time was in an ongoing state of hostility with France, its centuries-old rival, and that hostility extended to French products, especially French brandy and French wine, which had previously been the fashionable imported spirits of choice among the English upper classes. William's government, eager to damage the French economy and boost domestic English industry at the same time, passed a series of laws that did two things simultaneously. First, they placed heavy tariffs and outright bans on French brandy and wine imports. Second, and this is the part that changed history, they deregulated domestic distilling almost entirely. Under new legislation, any English subject could set up a still and begin distilling spirits from grain without needing a license from the Worshipful Company of Distillers, the guild that had previously controlled and limited production in London. All you needed was to give 10 days public notice of your intent to distill. This decision seemed like a minor bit of economic policy at the time. It was not. It was one of the most consequential deregulations in English history, and almost nobody in Parliament saw what was coming. Here is the uncomfortable reality that the deregulation created almost overnight. England, at the exact same moment, had a massive agricultural surplus of grain, particularly barley, sitting largely useless in the hands of landowners who desperately needed a new market for it. Grain prices had been depressed for years, and now, suddenly, there was a legal government-encouraged outlet for all of that surplus grain. Turn it into spirit. Not fine, well-aged spirit either. Cheap, fast, rough spirit flavored with juniper and whatever else was on hand to cover up the harsh taste, and sold as quickly as it could be produced. Landed gentry in Parliament, many of whom were themselves grain producers, had every financial incentive to keep this system running, and they did. The result was an explosion. In 1684, before the deregulation, English distillers produced roughly 500,000 gallons of spirits annually. By 1735, just 50 years later, that number had ballooned to an estimated 11 million gallons a year. 11 million gallons. Think about that for a second. In a country whose entire population at the time was only around 6 million people. Gin was not a luxury item anymore. It was flooding the market. And it was flooding it in London specifically, where poverty, overcrowding, and desperation created the perfect conditions for it to take hold. And this is where the story turns dark. London in the early 1700s was a brutal place to be poor. The city had exploded in population as rural workers pushed off increasingly enclosed farmland, flooded into the capital looking for work. Wages for unskilled labor were miserable. Housing was cramped, filthy, and often literally falling apart. There was no social safety net, no public health system, nothing standing between a bad week and starvation. Into this environment came a spirit that was, by design, extraordinarily cheap, often cheaper per unit of alcohol than beer, and far cheaper than the food that might have actually kept people alive. Gin was not just a drink in these neighborhoods. It was an anesthetic, a way to make an unbearable existence briefly bearable, and it was sold on nearly every street. By the 1720s and 1730s, contemporary estimates suggest that 1 in every 4 or 5 houses in some London parishes, particularly in the poorer districts of St. Giles and Holborn, was operating in some capacity as an unlicensed gin shop. Distillers sold gin directly from barrows, from windows, from makeshift stalls, often flavored not just with juniper, but with turpentine, sulfuric acid, and other cheap, dangerous additives used to fake strength or flavor when actual juniper and quality grain spirit were too expensive to bother with. This was not artisanal. This was industrial-scale, unregulated poison sold to the desperate. The advertising, if it can even be called that, was blunt to the point of being darkly comic by modern standards. A phrase widely reported from the era and repeated in contemporary accounts and later histories claimed that certain gin shops hung signs promising customers could get drunk for a penny, dead drunk for 2 pence, and straw for nothing. Straw referring to the clean bedding provided in a shop cellar for customers too incapacitated to make it home. Whether every shop in London literally used that exact wording remains debated among historians, since much of it comes down to us through second-hand and satirical sources. But the underlying business model it describes, cheap spirits, deeper intoxication for a few pennies more, and a place to sleep it off, was very real and widely documented. Streets in the poorest parts of the city reeked constantly of raw, poorly distilled spirit. Infant mortality in gin-soaked parishes climbed alarmingly, and coroners' inquests from the period repeatedly cite gin, sometimes directly, sometimes obliquely as spirituous liquors, as a contributing cause of death, in infants, in the elderly, and in the working poor alike. The artist William Hogarth captured the horror of this era in his 1751 engraving titled Gin Lane, one of the most famous pieces of social commentary in British art history. It depicts a street in collapse. A woman, too drunk and too diseased to notice, lets her infant slip from her arms and fall to its death down a stairwell. A man in the background has hanged himself. Buildings crumble. A pawnbroker's shop does brisk business as desperate residents sell their tools, their clothes, anything to buy another drink. Hogarth paired it with a companion engraving called Beer Street, showing a prosperous, cheerful, well-fed London built on good English beer, the contrast entirely deliberate. This was not just art. This was propaganda in service of a public health argument, and it worked precisely because the reality it exaggerated was not far from the truth. The court records from this period contain cases that are almost too grim to summarize plainly, but one in particular became a national scandal and a turning point in public opinion. In 1734, a London woman named Judith Dufour was tried and executed for the murder of her own 2-year-old daughter, Mary. Dufour had taken the child, who had been placed in a workhouse and given a new set of clothes, strangled her, left her body in a ditch, and sold the child's clothes for approximately 1 shilling and 4 pence, using the money to buy gin. The case horrified the nation, not because infanticide was unheard of, but because the motive was so nakedly, undeniably about the drink. This was not a battle over morality in the abstract. It was a mother killing her own child for the price of a bottle. Deaths attributed to gin consumption climbed steadily through the 1720s and 1730s. Physicians of the time, including the respected Dr. Thomas Wilson, wrote pamphlets warning that gin was, in his words, a poison that was killing more people annually than the plague had in its worst years. Whether every one of these contemporary estimates holds up to modern epidemiological scrutiny remains debated among historians, since record-keeping in this era was inconsistent at best. But what is not in dispute is that London's death rate genuinely began to exceed its birth rate during the worst years of the gin craze, a demographic warning sign so alarming that some contemporaries feared the city's population might begin to actually shrink. If you are finding this interesting, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week, and you will not want to miss what comes next, because the government's response to all of this was almost as chaotic as the crisis itself. Parliament's first attempts to control gin were clumsy, poorly enforced, and in some cases made the problem worse. The Jin Act of 1729 imposed licensing fees and taxes on gin retailers, but the fees were so easily evaded and enforcement so weak that the law was essentially ignored and quietly repealed within a few years. The Jin Act of 1736 was far more aggressive, imposing an enormous licensing fee of £50 annually for anyone wishing to sell gin legally, a sum wildly out of reach for the small-scale sellers who dominated the trade, alongside a steep tax on the spirit itself. The intent was to price gin out of existence. The result was closer to Prohibition-era chaos. Legal gin sales collapsed almost entirely, and in their place rose a massive underground network of illicit distilling and smuggling. Gin sold under coded nicknames, most famously Lady's Delight and Cuckold's Comfort, dispensed from hidden taps disguised as ordinary household objects. There is a well-documented case of a London vendor selling gin under the label Old Tom, dispensed through a hidden pipe from a wooden cat mounted on the wall, customers depositing a coin in the cat's mouth and receiving a shot of gin through a tube beneath its paw. It sounds almost too strange to be real. It was real. and it is part of why the London Dry style, eventually associated with a particular gin category, came to carry the Old Tom name in gin history. Riots broke out in response to the 1736 Act. Informers hired to catch illegal sellers were attacked in the streets, sometimes beaten, sometimes worse. And the law was so thoroughly unenforceable that it was effectively abandoned within a few years and formally repealed in 1743. This is the part that should make you angry, or at least should make you shake your head. Parliament had correctly identified a genuine public health crisis and then designed a solution so poorly matched to the reality of London's street life that it made the crisis worse in the short term, driving production further underground, further out of any regulatory oversight, and further away from any quality control on what was actually going into the bottle. And that repeal, ironically, triggered the very statistic that opened this story. The explosion of consumption that peaked around 1743, when annual per capita gin consumption in England reached levels historians still cite as a high watermark for spirits consumption in British history. This was not a battle being managed. It was a nation, quite literally, drinking itself into a demographic emergency while its lawmakers scrambled through their third or fourth failed attempt at a solution. It took one more law, better designed and more carefully enforced, to finally turn the tide. The Jin Act of 1751, championed in part by the novelist and magistrate Henry Fielding, who had witnessed the human wreckage of gin firsthand in his work as a London magistrate, took a fundamentally different approach. Rather than pricing gin out of reach through impossible fees, which had simply pushed the trade underground, the 1751 Act set moderate enforceable licensing costs, restricted sales to licensed premises such as taverns and inns rather than street sellers and private homes, and required distillers to sell only to licensed retailers rather than directly to the public. It was not perfect. It was not instant, but combined with rising grain prices in the 1750s, which made cheap gin production less profitable, and a broader cultural shift as reformers and religious movements increasingly stigmatized public drunkenness, gin consumption in England began a genuine, sustained decline through the second half of the 18th century. The gin craze was over. But gin itself was not going anywhere. It was about to be reinvented. Here's the detail that most people miss about gin's later history. The harsh, sweetened juniper and turpentine spirit of the gin craze era bears almost no resemblance to the crisp, dry gin sitting on liquor store shelves today. And the transformation between the two came down to a single piece of 19th century engineering. In 1830, an Irish inventor named Aeneas Coffey patented an improved continuous still, building on earlier designs, that could produce a far purer, more refined, higher proof spirit than the old pot stills ever could. Pot stills, the technology behind Genever and early English gin, produced a rough, oily, heavy spirit that needed to be masked with sugar and strong botanicals to be palatable at all. The coffee still changed that completely. It allowed distillers to produce a clean, neutral grain spirit as their base, and then redistill that spirit with juniper and other botanicals to create something crisp, aromatic, and crucially, dry, meaning unsweetened. This new style became known as London Dry Gin, and it did not just improve the product, it transformed gin's entire social status. Sweetened, cheap, Old Tom-style gin had always carried the stink of the slums. London Dry Gin, produced by increasingly sophisticated commercial distillers like Gordon's, founded in London in 1769, and Beefeater, founded later in the 19th century, was marketed as a respectable, even fashionable spirit. This was not just a rebranding exercise. It was, in a very real sense, the tobacco playbook applied to spirits. Take a product with a genuinely disreputable history, refine it technically, package it elegantly, and market it aggressively toward respectability until the public forgets, or at least stops mentioning, where it came from. And nowhere was that transformation more visible than in the gin palaces that began appearing across English cities in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. Lavishly decorated establishments with gas lighting, polished mahogany counters, ornate mirrors, and etched glass windows, designed to feel less like a slum gin shop and more like a glittering commercial theater. Some of these palaces boasted chandeliers and marble-topped bars that would not have looked out of place in a fashionable hotel. Charles Dickens himself wrote about these gin palaces, noting the strange contrast between their gaudy splendor and the poverty of many of the customers filing through their doors, describing the way ordinary, exhausted Londoners stepped out of filthy, poorly lit streets into rooms blazing with gaslight and polished brass. Gin had gone from a symbol of degradation to quite literally dressed up in glass and gaslight, a strange, almost theatrical inversion of everything the 1740s gin craze had represented. This time, the same spirit that had once been sold from a wooden cat's paw was being poured beneath crystal chandeliers. Meanwhile, thousands of miles away, gin was becoming tangled up with an entirely different chapter of history: British imperial expansion, and specifically, the British Army and Navy's centuries-long battle against malaria. This is the part that tends to catch people off guard. British colonial officers and soldiers stationed in malaria-prone regions of India and other tropical colonies in the 19th century were given regular doses of quinine, a bitter compound derived from the bark of the South American cinchona tree, which was one of the only effective treatments and preventatives for malaria available at the time. Quinine on its own was almost unbearably bitter, and enterprising officers began mixing it with soda water, sugar, and lime to make it more palatable, a drink that became known as tonic water. And what did British officers have plenty of sitting in the officers' mess that paired remarkably well with the bitter, citrus-forward flavor of tonic water? Gin. The gin and tonic, one of the most recognizable cocktails in the world today, was not invented by a bartender chasing a flavor trend. It was invented as a delivery mechanism for anti-malarial medicine, disguised as a refreshing colonial cocktail. Whether the exact moment of invention can be pinned to a single officer or regiment is disputed among drink historians. But the underlying medical logic behind the combination is very well documented in British East India Company and colonial military records. Gin's story through the 20th century is, in some ways, a quieter one, a steady presence rather than a dramatic crisis. It became the backbone of the classic cocktail era: the martini, the Tom Collins, the gin fizz, the Tom Collins's close cousin, the John Collins, all built around it during the cocktail renaissance of the late 19th and early 20th centuries in cities like London and New York, where elegant hotel bars competed to invent new combinations and new rituals around the spirit. The martini in particular, gin stirred or shaken with vermouth and served in that now iconic stemmed glass, became something close to a cultural shorthand for sophistication itself across mid-century American and European high society. It survived American Prohibition, which ran from 1920 to 1933, and in fact, somewhat perversely thrived during it, since gin was one of the easiest spirits to produce illegally, requiring no aging at all, unlike whiskey, which needs years sitting quietly in a barrel before it is drinkable. Bathtub gin, rough, homemade, and occasionally genuinely dangerous when made with improperly sourced industrial alcohol, became a defining phrase of the 1920s American underground drinking scene, an odd echo of the very same improvised, unregulated production that had defined London 2 centuries earlier. History, it turns out, has a habit of repeating its patterns, even when the century, the country, and the language have all changed completely. Today, the global gin market is valued at tens of billions of dollars annually, and it has undergone what industry analysts and drinks writers commonly call a craft gin renaissance over the past 2 decades, particularly across the United Kingdom, the United States, and increasingly Asia and Australia. Small batch distilleries have proliferated by the thousands, each competing to build a distinctive botanical profile beyond the traditional juniper base, incorporating everything from cucumber and rose to seaweed, native regional herbs, and foraged wild botanicals unique to their specific location. The United Kingdom alone is home to hundreds of gin distilleries today, more than at almost any point since the height of the 18th century gin craze, though the modern version bears no resemblance to the chaos of that earlier era. Heavily regulated, quality controlled, and marketed as an artisanal premium product rather than a cheap street anesthetic. Here is the detail that should genuinely surprise you. Unlike whiskey, rum, or brandy, gin, under most legal definitions, including those used in the United Kingdom, the European Union, and the United States, requires almost no aging at all. By law, gin simply needs to be a spirit predominantly flavored with juniper, distilled or redistilled with natural botanicals, and bottled at a minimum alcohol strength. That is essentially it. No years spent quietly maturing in oak barrels, no decades-long inventory sitting in a warehouse waiting to be sold. This single regulatory quirk is a large part of why the craft gin boom happens so fast and so widely. A new distillery can legally produce, bottle, and sell gin within weeks of opening its doors, something that is simply impossible for a whiskey producer who has to wait years before a single bottle can legally carry an age statement. Small entrepreneurs with a still, a handful of botanicals, and a good story could enter the spirits market almost overnight, and thousands of them did. Juniper itself, meanwhile, is still overwhelmingly wild harvested rather than farmed, gathered from scrubby hillsides in countries like Italy, Macedonia, and Albania largely by hand, in a process that has changed remarkably little since the medieval period. The same humble, bitter little berry that ancient Egyptian and Greek physicians once used to treat upset stomachs, picked from wild shrubs on a Balkan hillside, is now the defining flavor of a spirit poured in five-star hotel bars around the world, priced in some premium and small batch bottlings at well over $100 a bottle. It was there when Dutch soldiers steadied their nerves before battle. It was there when a king's political feud with France accidentally deregulated an entire industry. It was there when London's poorest families drank themselves into crisis, and when a mother sold her own child's clothes for the price of a bottle. It was there in Hogarth's engravings and in Dickens's gin palaces, dressed up in gaslight and etched glass. It was there in the officers' mess in colonial India, disguising bitter medicine as a refreshing cocktail. And it is there tonight, in your hand, garnished with a lime, mixed with tonic, in a drink most people order without a second thought about where any of it came from. Not bad for a spirit that Parliament once tried and repeatedly failed to legislate out of existence. If any part of this history surprised you, the deregulation that triggered a public health crisis, the wooden cat with gin flowing from its paw, the mother who killed her own daughter for a shilling and fourpence. Let me know in the comments which detail stuck with you the most. And if you enjoy stories like this, do me a favor and hit subscribe, because we have got a lot more of them coming. I will see you in the next one.